The richest cousin network that quietly owns Chicago? That's exactly what we're getting into right now. All right, picture Chicago for a second. Not the postcard version, not just the river dyed green, the skyline at sunset, or the tourists taking photos under the bean. Picture the real city. Hotels, office towers, civic boards, elite philanthropy dinners, universities, startup money, political fundraising, museum wings, private equity meetings, family offices, quiet conversations in rooms the public never sees. Now ask yourself a simple question. If there were one cousin network whose fingerprints kept turning up across all of that, whose name would it be? Because in Chicago, there is one answer that keeps showing up whether people want to admit it or not: the Pritzkers. And the reason this story is so good is that it does not work like a movie. This is not one single all-powerful patriarch towering over the city. This is a cousin network. A sprawling, rich, disciplined, occasionally messy, deeply connected network of relatives whose reach extends through hotels, private investments, politics, philanthropy, real estate, education, and the civic architecture of Chicago itself. Most people understand dynasties in simple shapes: a founder, then children, then maybe one or two heirs fighting for control. The Pritzker story is more complicated than that, which is exactly why it matters. This is not just a rich family. It is a multi-branch cousin structure that has managed to stay economically, socially, and institutionally relevant across generations. That matters because cousin networks can do something single heirs cannot. They can spread influence across multiple sectors at once without losing the family name. One branch goes deeper into finance, another into politics, another into hotels, another into philanthropy, another into venture capital, another into civic institutions. Suddenly, the family is no longer tied to one asset. It becomes tied to an entire ecosystem of assets, boards, donations, influence channels, and public legitimacy. That is what makes this story feel less like a business biography and more like city infrastructure. When the same last name keeps appearing in hospitality, private capital, government, elite nonprofits, major universities, and cultural institutions, you are no longer dealing with random success. Like a lot of serious American fortunes, the Pritzker Empire did not begin looking like an empire. The family roots trace back to immigrants from Ukraine who came to Chicago and built upward from there. Abram Nicholas Pritzker and his brother Jack moved from the family law world into investment, real estate, and business acquisition, gradually building a fortune through patience, opportunism, and structure. That part is important. They were not just lucky. They were strategic in a very Chicago way. They did not need glamour first. They needed footholds. Then they needed leverage. Then they needed scale. Over time, the family fortune grew through a disciplined mix of deals, private holdings, and especially the rise of Hyatt. That is where the broader public finally started to recognize the scale. But even then, the public version of the story was still smaller than the real thing, because Hyatt was never the whole story. Hyatt was the famous door into the mansion. Behind it sat trusts, private companies, investment structures, and a culture of wealth management that made the family far more formidable than one hotel brand alone could explain. And once a family learns how to multiply capital through structures instead of just salaries or public stock appreciation, that family stops being rich in the normal sense. It becomes dynastic. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when they think about the Pritzkers. They reduce the network to the Hyatt family, which is like calling a large military force the people with the front gate. Yes, Hyatt matters enormously. Hyatt gave the family a visible global brand, a prestige platform, and a durable stream of wealth tied to one of the most status-rich industries in the world, hospitality. But the real significance of Hyatt is not just that it made them rich. It taught the family how to think at scale. Hotels are not just rooms and lobbies. They are land plays, brand systems, financing structures, real estate timing, management, discipline, urban presence, global positioning. Once a cousin network is shaped by that kind of business, It begins to understand how to occupy cities, physically and symbolically, at the same time. Hyatt gave the Pritzkers public stature, but the larger family machine extended well beyond it into private equity, industrial holdings, philanthropy, and political reach. That is why the word network matters so much. Different cousins could move through different lanes while still benefiting from the family gravity created by the original fortune. Some cities are too flashy for quiet dynasties to hide in plain sight. Chicago is not one of them. Chicago understands family power. It understands old money, institutional boards, private deals, political alliances, and elite philanthropy that doubles as social architecture. It is a city where names matter, but where names do not always have to be screamed to be felt. In fact, understated power often travels better there. Chicago is big enough to generate serious wealth, but small enough in its upper tier circles for the same surnames to keep reappearing. University boards, museum galas, civic committees, development conversations, campaign finance, nonprofit leadership, high-end business networks. Once a family is deeply embedded in all of that, the city begins to function partly through recognition. The Pritzkers fit this environment perfectly. They are not random billionaires who happen to park their money in the city. They are woven into the city's elite operating culture. That is a much deeper form of ownership than title deeds alone. And that is exactly why it became so powerful. A family tied to one great company can be rich. A family that branches into multiple elite sectors can become something else entirely. Look at the Pritzker cousin network and you start seeing the full spread. Hospitality, obviously, private investment, venture capital, philanthropy, politics, education, civic leadership. Even when individual cousins take different routes, the cumulative effect remains the same. The family stays near the center of consequential Chicago life. That is a major distinction. Wealth by itself does not guarantee influence. Plenty of rich people are just rich spectators. They own things, donate a little, and live comfortably. Networks like this do more than own assets. They occupy channels. Penny Pritzker became a major business and public figure, even serving as U.S. Commerce Secretary. J.B. Pritzker moved directly into political power and became governor of Illinois. Tom Pritzker stayed deeply identified with Hyatt and high-level business leadership. Other branches operated through private capital, philanthropy, or related family enterprises. That spread matters because it makes the network harder to isolate. If one lane cools down, another stays hot. If hospitality slows, politics still matters. If politics gets noisy, philanthropy remains respectable. This is where people get confused when they hear a title like quietly owns Chicago. They imagine literal ownership, as if the claim only works if one family controls every major building, company, or institution. That is not how real urban power works. Real city power is distributed. It flows through relationships, boards, donations, campaigns, projects, convenings, brands, and the invisible trust that elite networks place in familiar names. The Pritzker cousin network does not need to hold every asset in Chicago to shape the texture of the city. It only needs repeated relevance in enough high-level rooms that the city's most important decisions keep unfolding within a world the family already understands. That is much stronger than one loud monopolistic presence. It is social infrastructure. It means the network can influence where capital goes, which civic priorities rise, which institutions feel secure, which leaders get amplified, and which projects attract legitimacy. By the time the public notices, the real work is already done. That is why quiet family power is so hard to map. Now, to be fair, philanthropy at this level can absolutely do real public good. Chicago's universities, cultural institutions, medical initiatives, and civic spaces have all benefited from elite family generosity over the years. The point is not that giving is fake. The point is that giving also has structural value for the giver. When a cousin network donates at scale, it does more than help causes. It anchors the family's legitimacy. It places the name inside institutions meant to outlive any individual business cycle. It ties the network to education, medicine, culture, and reform in a way that makes the family seem less like a concentration of private wealth and more like part of the city's backbone. That is powerful. It changes how the public class sees you. It changes how elite institutions treat you. It changes how younger generations inherit not just money, but prestige. The Pritzkers understood this. Their name is attached not merely to commerce, but to civic life. Once a family becomes legible as both capitalist and benefactor, its influence gets harder to challenge without sounding naive or ungrateful. If you want one reason the broader public began to grasp just how enormous this cousin network really is, look at politics. The moment J.B. Pritzker entered the highest level of Illinois politics, the family shifted in the public imagination from rich to structurally powerful. Being rich is one thing, governing the state that contained Chicago is another. Suddenly, the network was no longer just associated with elite business and philanthropy, it was tied directly to executive authority. And even beyond formal office, the political implications ran deeper. A family with that much money, donor capacity, institutional respect, and name recognition does not merely participate in politics, it alters the weight distribution inside politics. Add in Penny Pritzker's national profile, and it becomes even clearer that this cousin network learned how to extend beyond the private sector without surrendering the advantages of being privately wealthy. That is rare. Some families are good at business and terrible at politics. Others gain political visibility and lose their mystique. The Pritzker network showed it could move between both worlds, which makes Chicago feel even more like home territory for them. Business power plus civic prestige plus real political presence is not a normal combination. It is dynastic power in full urban form. This might be the single smartest thing about the whole structure. If one billionaire becomes too visible, too controversial, or too associated with one failing project, the whole public image can wobble. Networks are different. Cousin networks disperse risk. No one person has to carry the entire myth. No one person has to be perfect. One cousin can dominate headlines while another remains respectable in philanthropy. One branch can absorb criticism while another continues operating quietly in finance or business. The family name survives because it is not resting on one body. It is distributed across relatives, roles, industries, and institutions. That is an extraordinary advantage. It also means the network can feel omnipresent without feeling singular. Chicagoans may not spend their day thinking about the Pritzker cousins collectively, but they keep encountering versions of the family in different contexts. Politics here, hotels there, civic giving somewhere else, venture and private capital in another room entirely. That repetition creates a strange effect. The family starts to feel less like a set of individuals and more like a permanent feature of the city's upper operating system. There's another reason this family shape matters so much. Cousin networks can survive in ways solo heirs often cannot. If one person controls everything, the dynasty becomes emotionally fragile. A divorce, a scandal, a political failure, a bad acquisition, a health crisis, or a disastrous ego trip can throw the entire empire off balance. Networks do not wobble the same way. They spread responsibility, visibility, and reputation across multiple branches at once. One cousin can be the public political figure. Another can stay in business leadership. Another can operate in private capital. Another can be known more for philanthropy and cultural patronage. Collectively, the family remains important even if individually some relatives are louder, weaker, smarter, or more controversial than others. That is a massive advantage in a city like Chicago, where continuity matters more than drama. The Pritzkers do not need every cousin to be perfect. They just need enough branches to remain active and enough power centers long enough that the family keeps renewing its place near the top. This is also why the family can feel larger than any one headline. A mayor can lose. A governor can age out. A business executive can step back. A company can restructure. But a cousin network with deep capital, institutional placement, and social memory can keep going. That makes it less like a corporation and more like a private civic organism. It adapts, it shifts weight, it redirects attention, it absorbs shocks, and keeps functioning. And for everyone outside that network, that is what makes it so hard to compete with. You are not just up against money, you are up against generations of accumulated relationships working in parallel. This is one of those truths people in big cities understand instinctively, but rarely say out loud. At the highest levels of urban influence, introductions matter almost as much as ideas. Credibility matters before the pitch even begins. Familiarity matters before the meeting is scheduled. And when a family has spent decades placing its name inside Chicago's business, civic, educational, and political worlds, the doors start opening earlier for people connected to that name. Not because every cousin receives some magical automatic success code, but because elite institutions are built on trust, recognition, and pattern memory. The name has already been processed. It already means something. It already signals access to capital, seriousness, continuity, and social importance. That kind of advantage compounds quietly. It helps explain why families like this can keep shaping a city without always dominating the front page. The real win is not just winning visible battles. The real win is rarely having to fight from scratch in the first place. When your surname already belongs to the vocabulary of the city's upper circles, you enter the room with momentum. That does not guarantee success, but it changes the temperature of the room before you say a word. Chicago has many ambitious people, many rich people, many talented people. What it has far fewer of are families whose name functions almost like preloaded institutional context. The Pritzkers have that advantage, and once you notice it, the phrase quietly owns Chicago stops sounding exaggerated and starts sounding like a description of how elite city power actually works. And no, this has not always been a tidy fairy tale. One reason the Pritzker story is so useful is that it reveals what happens when gigantic private wealth gets spread across branches and cousins. There were feuds, lawsuits, internal disputes over trusts, control, and distribution. That is almost inevitable at this scale. In fact, the existence of conflict makes the family's continued relevance more impressive, not less, because most networks get weaker when the money gets that big and the branches get that numerous. The Pritzkers fought? Sure. But the broader family gravity survived. That matters. It tells you the underlying structures were strong enough to absorb human mess without destroying the dynasty itself. In other words, even when the cousins disagreed, the city still had to deal with the fact that the Pritzkers, as a collective force, remained embedded in Chicago power. A fragile network would have fractured into irrelevance. This one did not. That is what separates a rich family from a true urban dynasty. Dynasties survive not because they are harmonious, but because their institutional position is strong enough to outlast the arguments. After a while, you stop seeing separate headlines and start seeing one picture. Hyatt, Pritzker Prize-level prestige, political leadership, venture, and private capital, museum and university influence, philanthropy, institutional respect, elite continuity. Suddenly, the question is no longer whether this cousin network matters. The question is how anyone ever thought it did not. That is the strange genius of quiet power. It hides in familiarity. A name appears so often that people stop noticing it. But repeated appearance is the whole point. Once a family becomes normal at the top of a city, it becomes harder to imagine the city's elite machinery functioning without it. That is what quietly owned Chicago really means here. Not that every block belongs to them on paper. Not that every decision comes from a cousin conference call. It means the city's serious upper-level systems keep intersecting with their name, their money, their institutions, their politics, and their legitimacy. So let's land this. The richest cousin network that quietly owns Chicago is the Pritzker family, because they did not just build a fortune, they built a multi-branch system that spread across hotels, private investment, politics, philanthropy, and civic life until the city's elite architecture kept reflecting their name back at itself. That is the trick. Not one mogul, not one company, a cousin network. And in a city like Chicago, that may be the most powerful shape of all.